Anybody follows cybersecurity? It's been a hell of a year, huh? Okay. The good news is that we got lots of stuff to talk about, right? So this is going to be a little bit of kind of a reflection on what we've experienced over the past year or so, and then how those are shaping some of the predictions that we think are going to shape the future, especially as it relates to connected things. I think the most important subtlety that we need to get on the table to start with is that right now we have roughly 11 billion-ish connected things. We're connecting about 4,800 new things every minute of every day. IDC predicts that by 2025, we'll be connecting 152,000 things every minute of every day. So that's a hell of a growth trajectory. And when you realize that the big struggle that we're trying to deal with here is that most of these things, especially those that are going into consumers' homes and things like that, really have no security in them at all. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have in this space, some of the things that are shaping the security industry, and why we think it's time to pay particular attention on what's going on at the intersection of connected things and cybersecurity. So net, it has been just an extraordinary year. This doesn't begin to reflect the number of security events that we've experienced in the past year or so. I can tell you from a practitioner of security, it seems like back in 2014 when Heartbleed, the SSL vulnerability hit, it threw our whole industry into a state of panic, right? Fast forward to this year, you had WannaCry, you had Petya, you had the Equifax breach, you had the crack vulnerability, you have Spectre, Meltdown, you have all these, the culmination of all these things, everything from cyber attacks to vulnerabilities to exploits just that are coming at us at a speed that's just making it really, really difficult to keep ahead of the power curve when it comes to cybersecurity. So let's talk a little bit before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty of this about who the actors are. Who are the people that are making a name for themselves or trying to make a name for themselves in this space, this space that includes a variety of different attributes and effects. But I think probably the most well-known that you hear a lot about in the news are the nation states. The North Koreas of the world, the Irans, the Russias, these countries out there, China, that have cyber armies who every day are trying to really disrupt the ecosystem as we know it. And they're doing everything from trying to steal intellectual property to trying to, obviously everybody knew when North Korea attacked Sony, the intent was to just kind of take Sony out because they're upset about a movie they created. So the reasons why vary country to country. But suffice it to say that the thing that makes nation states so interesting is that they're well-funded and they are going after just you name it, and they're in there deep. The second group that gets quite a bit of notoriety, not quite as much as nation states nowadays. Oh, by the way, before I go on, North Korea has been given attribution for WannaCry. Recall WannaCry in our space was a piece of ransomware that was a global cyber attack, affected some 230 countries back in the latter part of next year. Highly disruptive, and the challenge that we're seeing in the space tied specifically to WannaCry, and for that matter, Petya, was the fact that it kind of redefined the cyber attack playbook. It used to be most of these attacks were really isolated, very focused on a company or an individual organization, something like that. Now they're just doing broadcast distribution and trying to infect as many organizations as possible and just try to cause as much disruption as possible. So that's one of the things that we're paying very close attention to, is that we've gone are the days where you would hear about a denial of service attack against a bank or something like that. Now we're seeing whole-scale attacks against entire industries and countries in a very coordinated way, which causes us some alarm. Hacktivists, on the other hand, typically are tied to causes, right? They're upset at the practices of a university or a law enforcement agency or a bank or something like that, and they direct their efforts on trying to either disrupt that organization or somehow cause them some bad PR. And they tend to be very vocal in their attacks. They go on record saying, yes, we as Anonymous or we as organizations, Hacktivist XYZ, have actually done this. Now, an interesting distinction as we go between these different actors is that there's a lot of crossover, right? Somebody who maybe is part of a nation-state cyber army may also be part of a hacktivist group, may also be a cyber criminal. So there's a lot of cross-pollination, for lack of better words, for these bad actors, and we see more and more of that. So they're basically taking what they're learning from these different operating disciplines, for lack of a better word, and applying it in other spaces. Another interesting group that we keep a really close tab on is organized crime networks. And these guys, that's simple. This is all about making money. Right? What can they do to make money? How can they extract money as quickly as possible, get in, get out, and make an impact? There was a time, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, where proximity mattered when committing a crime. It doesn't matter anymore. You can sit in your whitey tighties in the comfort in the darkest corner of the web and conduct a cyber attack, and if it pays dividends, fine. If it doesn't, that's fine too. But it is important to note that the typical ROI on a piece of malware is about 1,800%. So there's gold in there. When these guys go out and do their wares and attack people, attack organizations, for the most part, they're being very lucrative and very profitable. Now, we have been working really closely with law enforcement and trying to bring these organizations to justice. We'll help them with forensics and understanding how these attacks are structured and understanding where to go direct their efforts. And we actually took down one of the leading ransomware organizations just a couple months ago in Ukraine. And then finally, and this is the thing I'm going to double click on, is individuals and gamers. Last year I was at a meeting in the UK, and the gentleman I was talking to is the Chief Innovation Officer for one of our partners, and he was talking about the evolution of gamers into cybercrime. And what makes it particularly interesting is that most of these gamers don't necessarily know that they're getting ready to commit a crime. He told me about a young man in, where was it, Leicester or something like that in the UK. So the cops go to this door and they knock on the door and they say, we have evidence of a cybercrime being committed here. The mother and father say, we just have feature phones, so it's surely not us. The only computer we have in our home is in our son's room, and he just games, so he's not doing anything. So they go up to the son's room. He's 14, I think, 12 or 14. And they knock on his door, and sure enough, he had launched a Trojan, banking Trojan, stole $2.3 million, and then blew that entire amount with online gambling. So the point is, he was really good at getting that Trojan to go, really, really bad at online gambling. But it's just, and I suspect, and I wasn't that close to this thing, but I suspect he didn't think it was real money. As numbers kind of went across his screen and across his monitor, he maybe didn't really understand that those are real dollars coming from real organizations and real consumers and making really bad things happen. And when you just lose it all away, it was just an amazing thing to behold. So anyways, the point is that they're getting these gamers, and keep in mind the gamer mentality, right? The gamer mentality is all tied to taking it to the next level. In fact, one of the usually the first segue into cyber criminal activity for these gamers is this thing called booting. They're in these massive multiplayer games. They're out there in all hours of the night. They get to the point where they can't go to the next level because the sniper keeps shooting them, right? So for $7, they launch a denial of service attack at that IP address of that sniper that keeps taking them out so the guy can go to the next level and keep on advancing. And that is how they get into it. That's how they kind of, the crack starts into the first time. And then they start getting addicted to that notion of what other things could I do. And trust me when I tell you that as we sit in this room right now, we are 3 clicks from going as dark in the web as you want to go. We can take you to online exchanges, to places where you can buy malware. I can show you places on YouTube where you can learn how to deploy it and do all sorts of things. And if you're a little bit lazy, you just don't want to go through the hassle of learning how to do it, you can launch one of these services, and they can just do it all for you. So Yeah, it's a real thing. And we're seeing more and more instances where younger people are getting into this, and my fear is that the consequences are going to be severe as they get more and more of this, and they understand what's happening more so on the dark side than what can happen from other good sources. So instead of sitting there trying to count all those zeros, that's a petabyte. That is the size of our threat intelligence network called Global Threat Intelligence. It's roughly a third larger than the next largest threat intelligence network, and that's where we keep everything. To give you an idea of perspective, a petabyte is about 2,000 of your favorite songs playing back to back for over 2,000 years. It's a lot of data. And it's the data we use to inform our products, to understand the environment, what's going on. This same global threat intelligence gets 44 billion queries a day, or roughly 500,000 every second. That's more than Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and what's the other one? Combined. Anyways, it's literally, it lights up in a very significant way. And there's a lot of intelligence that we use to inform our systems. From this petabyte of data, we right now have about 723 million malware samples. We find about 4 new samples every second of every day. And what's starting to really make us concerned is where these samples are starting to materialize. For the longest time, this was pretty much before I go on, we have a petabyte of data, which obviously is a lot, and we use it to inform our products and share this with industry to make sure that everybody can be informed as they help fight cyber criminal activities and whatnot. But the bad guys are to the point where they also have lots and lots of data, right? And they're just now getting to the point where they're using machine learning and artificial intelligence in order to hone their operations, right? The more specific they can get to an organization, the more they can understand the operating principles, the structure, the monetization, how a company operates, and the more they can kind of tailor their attacks to disrupt that business, the more effective they can be. Some of the more common things that we hear about in our space are things called whale phishing and spear phishing, which are terms for those instances where you go after very targeted individuals with a very targeted campaign to make something happen. Last year, perhaps maybe you heard the Milwaukee Bucks organization was affected by this, where everybody in the entire Milwaukee Bucks organization got an email from their CEO asking for the username password to log into the corporate systems. And of course, it looked legit, right? It looked like it was in the right format, the right structure from the right domain, so almost everybody provided it. It was an extremely disruptive time for the Milwaukee Bucks. But the point here is that even though we take out a lot of data, and our data grows every day, the bad guys are also taking a lot of data. A good example of this is we helped take a botnet down, I think back in 2016, and part of the process that law enforcement invited us in to take a look at the servers and understand the deeper operation from getting access to their systems. And what we found was really interesting, and the level of data and depth they had on a number of individuals. So we actually took the data from one individual and went to this individual's home, and again, we knocked on his door, and we were there with law enforcement, and we said, are you John Smith? Yes, I'm John Smith. We're with McAfee, we helped take down this botnet. Oh, by the way, here's what we found about you. And it was literally every piece of information about this guy ever. Date of birth, mother's maiden name, address, anything every username, password, every security word, everything that he'd ever done in any site ever was in this system. And the question he asked us was the question of the ages. So what do I do? Right, and that's the rub. That's the challenge. The challenge is that once this data is out there in mass, it's impossible to pull it back. It moves around. It's bought, sold. It's moved from place to place to place, but it never goes away. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit. Is the importance of privacy and being diligent and making sure as we get into the IoT space and we deploy more systems that we're mindful of the data that we're collecting and what we're doing with that data. So anyways, as I was saying before, we continue to see growth in virtually every segment, right? PC is by far the largest segment, even though it's not seeing the most growth. If you see what's interesting here is the bad guys are shifting their focus to the popular platforms today, right? Everybody's got mobile phones now. Mac is gaining critical mass, so now they're targeting Macs more. If you spend any time about what's going on in cybersecurity, Macs are being targeted at an alarming increasing rate right now. Android is under great pressure from cyber criminals who are finding all sorts of ways to violate that operating system and do harm. But the one segment that we are paying very close attention to, because it's really a function of what's going around cryptocurrency and anonymous payments, is this thing called ransomware. Which, imagine you wake up one day and you go to your favorite website and you can't log into your system until you pay a ransom. That's kind of the nature of ransomware. And that has just grown like gangbusters over this past year, because it's impossible to track the payments of this, and it's a highly lucrative and profitable way for the cyber criminal to make money, and state-sponsored. And even within the segment of ransomware, there's been an extraordinary amount of shaping just in this past year. It used to be ransomware was very explicit. It would go and it would lock up a certain number of files. It would ask for a ransom, and if you didn't pay the ransom in a certain amount of time, it locked those files up forever. But in the interest of making money and trying to do other things, even the ransomware authors have made a lot of changes to their systems to make them more to avoid detection. That's one of the things called the anti-sandboxing, where they'll actually use techniques to determine whether or not their software is going to be deployed in a sandbox environment, and then not execute because it knows it'll be detected as a piece of malware. A variable ransom was something that we saw with NotPetya, where basically if you didn't pay in a certain amount of time, they'd increase the ransom. Right? It used to be ransoms were just fixed amounts. You paid it in a certain amount of time or it went away. We've gone from just seeing certain files encrypted to the entire disk being encrypted. So if you don't pay the ransom, you lose all the data on there. In fact, I saw an instance of this at a surf shop in California, where the gentleman lost 10 years of data because the ransomware demand basically encrypted the entire disk and couldn't get it back. One of the things we saw this year for the first time was website encryption. A commerce site in South Korea was targeted with a piece of ransomware which locked up certain files to allow the commerce to take place, and those were locked up so people couldn't come to their site and buy stuff. And there'll be a rhyme to the reason of this in just a moment. And the exploit kits are getting, more accessible. It's easier to find them than it used to be. And now we're seeing ransomware as a service, where instead of, again, you having to go, build your own ransomware campaign and go do your own targeting, they'll do it all for you. You just pay a small fee, and then you'll get the profits of whatever the ransomware provider will pay you. So here's one of the predictions we think is going to happen. That because ransomware has been so popular for the past couple of years, and because the industry has become more informed, because the defenses against ransomware have gotten more robust, that they're going to start pivoting to different targets. And this is where it gets really interesting for IoT, because one of those targets is going to be connected things. And we're seeing this happen even today. And matter of fact, we're starting to see instances where it's called ransomware denial of service attacks, where basically they'll launch a denial of service attack against an organization in demand for ransomware. Typically, most of the denial of service attacks we've historically seen have been more at hacktivists and people like that. Now they're shifting over to, okay, I'm going to take your site down until you pay me a ransom. And we're seeing that happen today. And what's making this worse is we're seeing a lot of farming going on where the bad guys in particular are looking after connected things in order to build these massive botnets so they can do these denial of service attacks en masse. Well, we actually did this. We actually went and bought a commercial off-the-shelf third-party infotainment system for a car, connected it to the CAN bus system, which is, if you ever get your car service, they have this thing they put in that's called the CAN bus to get diagnostics and stuff like that. So actually went and looked at one of these systems and were able to install ransomware on an infotainment system. Now imagine the use case here, right? You get up, going to work, you're maybe halfway to work, your car stops until you pay a ransom. That's what we think is going to be the next major shift in some of the cyber criminal or cyber activities we're going to see are a shift from more traditional PCs and mobiles and stuff like that, and focus on connected things. So we're becoming so reliant on things that it's going to be impossible for them not to try to figure out how to exploit that. And we go back to the original statement, which was, the component manufacturers, the device manufacturers, are spending very little time thinking about how do we safeguard these devices. And they're solving for time to market and convenience. And they're putting these devices in the hands of the consumers in such a state that the consumers or organizations, for that matter, don't know how to keep them safe, how to keep them from being attacked. In fact, McKinsey Group just released some research in 2017, which talked to 400 information technologists, and basically found that 86% of companies agree that this is going to be, that connected things are going to be what's going to be the attack vector of the future, but yet only 16% felt that they were adequately prepared to deal with attacks against that attack surface. They're really good at dealing with attacks against their network, attacks against their endpoints, and things like that. They're really not very well versed and very well armed in how do we deal with attacks against our connected things. A good example of this is a university in Austria flew a drone next to a building, an office building, basically did a direct injection of malware into a connected light bulb, which in turn infected every light bulb in the organization. The capacity for thinking about how to do these types of things is getting extremely interesting. So, IoT threats. We talked a little bit about this a couple minutes ago. There's really two sides to this coin. One side is that we are putting these devices en masse, and we've already seen substantial attacks against these devices. Go back to the DNS attack back in late 2016. Right, that was a 620 gigabyte per second attack against the DNS servers, took down a large chunk of the eastern seaboard as far as the connectivity goes. And I'll talk about in a moment, but the malware that was used for this has not only been made open source, Mirai, so we're seeing a bunch of variants of it now, we're also seeing an increase in the overall size of the bot. And it's getting pretty alarming as far as how its growth goes. And then, as I said before, the other side of this coin is that it's too easy for these guys to get access to these devices. It's just, the device manufacturers just aren't really spending any time or thought to how do we make a more secure device. And they're not using things like encrypted services and strong authentication, things like that. So they're getting into to businesses and homes and they're being easily exploited. So it's really come down to a tale of two evils. There's Mirai, as I mentioned before, is the botnet that took down the DNS. It was really popular about a year and a half ago. And the way it gets distributed is when something connects, basically it'll tell the internet it's available. And then the next thing you know, when an authentication will come to it, and then part of the Mirai architecture will go talk to that device and try a couple default username passwords. If one of them works, it goes in, it lays down the malware, then it moves on. Works pretty well. I'll explain that a little bit more. Reaper, which just came out last year, is a different strain of malware. Instead of using username password as the primary way of getting and planning itself, it will look for known vulnerabilities and connected things and exploit that way. And then what makes Reaper even more interesting is once it inserts itself on a device, it'll start going horizontally and see if they can find any more instances of that same vulnerability against other devices deployed in an organization. Both of these are getting scarily big. There's one estimate that puts the number of connected things in the Reaper at just over 1 million devices. And just for perspective, when we talked about the denial of service attack service that took down the DIN DNS servers, that was, I want to say, 230,000 devices. They suspect, there's been a couple of predictions to say that both Mirai and Reaper have the potential to get so large it could take down the entire internet. Imagine how disruptive that would be, right? So we actually, in an attempt to better understand what the bad guys do, we're always messing around with things. So we went out and bought a off-the-shelf DVR, connected DVR, took it into our lab, fired it up. In full disclosure, this was a honeypot type of situations. In a lot of cases, a DVR at a home is going to be behind a firewall or something like that, so the chances of it getting a direct access is not very high, but it's not impossible. So anyways, we're trying to understand the, how could this happen sort of thing. So anyways, we brought this DVR in, turned it on, we'll let it sit there. Within about 30 seconds, it started getting pings, right? Things looking out for it. Within 64 seconds, the device had been crawled, authenticated, and malware installed in 64 seconds. Now, go back to the numbers we talked about before, where today we're connecting 4,800 new devices every minute of every day. And imagine a world where as soon as those devices fire up, and especially if they're talking on a public IP, what's going to happen, right? As soon as those devices have a signal, something's going to talk to them. Hopefully it's a service they're intended to talk to, but we're finding out in the real world it's not. It's a variety of nefarious services that are trying to access that device in order to put some sort of malware in it to do different things. And another interesting point of the evolution of malware in this space is it used to be this was all just being used for denial of service attacks. Bad, but pretty straightforward. But we've seen instances where they've actually repurposed this malware to do things like Bitcoin mining, right? So imagine your thermostat in your home being used to help mine Bitcoins without your knowledge, and also to do other type of cross attacks. So what we're seeing is instances where they'll try to infect the device in the home, hop over through your router to a laptop or PC and something you're going to take into your workplace, and then infect your workplace. Those are the type of attacks that we think are going to gain in prevalence over the course of the next couple of years. A little bit about privacy, then I got to wrap it up because it looks like I got about a minute left. One of the things that we need to be very, very mindful of as we build these new connected devices is that we tend to ask for more information than we need to deliver a good or service. And my ask is that we caution ourselves instead of doing that. And the reason is sound. It's like inevitably what's going to happen is you're going to go aspire to collect all this data that you don't need that's going to readily identify that person. And one or two things is going to happen. Either that device is going or that data is going to be breached and that data is going to be used for other purposes, or it's going to be made accessible and you're going to try to do things malicious with that data even though that wasn't your initial intent. How many of you actually have ever read a privacy agreement? You got one guy, a couple of people have read privacy agreements. They're typically not for the faint of heart. They're usually written by lawyers. They're intended to be legal heavy, and so we tend just to say agree and move on, right? The challenge with privacy agreements, almost every privacy agreement states that they have the right at any time to change a privacy agreement. Remember, I think it was a year and a half ago, the VTech, right, makes children's connected toys. Right, they found, I think, some 10 million instances where they had taken information, private information about children that they shouldn't have taken. So instead of actually, changing their policies, they decided, you know what, we're going to go ahead and pay the fine. So keep in mind, millions of devices. I think it was 10 million, if my memory serves me, and they ended up paying a $650,000 fine because they felt that just paying the fine and continuing to do what they do was better business than actually trying to change our privacy policies to make them better for children. And this is the thing that we have to condition ourselves against, because this is the sort of thing that if we're not mindful of it, we're going to get greedy with the data, and then something bad's going to happen, and the regulatory bodies are going to step in, and they're going to make it really, really difficult for us to be able to collect any amount of data on a go-forward basis. I know I'm running a little bit over here, and I'm getting the hook over here. And this is what I mentioned, that basically we predict that the corporations are willing to break existing laws because the fines and the penalties today and the consequences for doing something bad isn't strong enough for them to not do it. And I suspect that if we aren't mindful of this, that it's going to get really, really bad, and we're going to see more things like GDPR, which is just getting ready to roll out in EMEA, which is going to have more universal appeal, because the consumer is going to bite back and say, we need to stop this. I was going to take a moment about crack. Just so you know, crack was a really, really bad vulnerability in the WPA2 protocol, net, and everything that connected over Wi-Fi was probably vulnerable to crack. And this happened. So it's one thing to say we have all these connected things coming online. We know they're not secure, but when you wake up one day and find that the protocol that all these devices were using to talk over Wi-Fi to all these connected things is equally vulnerable, it's made for just a really, really interesting year in my space. I thank you for your time and attention. I think I'm getting the hook to...
A round of applause for Gary Davis, please. This is wonderful.
Gary,